when I started writing the book, the apex of it was the data economy and the idea that data is a central part of what we do in our business. And what I recognized was that as I was writing the book and I saw the explosion of what's happening in the AI space, I realized that the horizons that I had thought in my head for when some of this intelligent technology was going to become available and useful and really achieve some major milestones like artificial general intelligence and potentially super intelligence, those were going to happen in a much shorter horizon than I expected. If you asked me in 2021, when would we have AGI, I would have said 2100. And now I will say 2030, thereabouts.
Welcome to Founded and Funded. This is Coral Garnick-Duckin, digital editor here at Madrona. This week we have the pleasure of having former Snowflake CEO Bob Muglia join us again on the show. Bob is an active investor and sits on the boards of many next-generation data platform companies. And more recently, he launched his first book called Datapreneurs. Given the long history between Bob and Soma, one of our managing directors here at Madrona, we had to have Bob join us again to talk about his new book and dive into the world of data and AI. These two old friends discuss what exactly a datapreneur is and what Bob called in his book the arc of data innovation and how the speed of progress of technology has increased through the years. They also talk through how companies can add value with AI through copilots and agents, and what white spaces and opportunities there are out there for entrepreneurs right now, especially when it comes to semantic models. They talk about all of this and so much more, so I'll hand it off to Soma to dive in. But first, I want to let you all know that our 2023 Intelligent Applications Summit is happening on October 11th and 12th. If you're interested, visit i40.com/summit to request an invite. Now I'll hand it over to Soma to take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Soma, a managing director here at Madrona. Today, I'm really excited to have Bob Muglia, a datapreneur himself, with a large body of data platform work to his credit across Microsoft, where he was one of the top most senior executives, and then most recently, where he was the former CEO of Snowflake. Bob is also an active investor and sits on the boards of many next-generation data platform and tools companies. Before we launch into our conversation today, Bob, I do want to take this opportunity to congratulate you on publishing your first book, Datapreneurs.
I appreciate it. It was more work than I anticipated it was going to be.
But Bob, given your experience and accomplishments in the world of data over the last 35 plus years, I'm not at all surprised to see the focus of your book, which explores the people and critical pivots in technology history that catapulted us into the modern age of computing and AI. Bob, I thought we'll just jump quickly into a set of questions that I have for you today to start off the conversation. First, how do you define datapreneurs, Bob? And more importantly, how do you see their contribution in building the data economy of today and in the future?
Well, a datapreneur is simply the concatenation of a data entrepreneur together, and that's where the term comes from. And this realization, I was worked on the book with my co-author, Steve Ham, and when we first started writing the book in 2021, we really didn't have a specific objective in mind. We didn't start by saying we're going to wind up writing a book. I knew I'd had some things to say and communicate, and we were trying to decide the best vehicle to do this. And after Steve and I talked for a little bit, it was obvious there was a narrative that could be had and turned into a book. And so we started outlining the chapters and things. And in that, I realized, in that process of those conversations, I realized that through my career, even though I was working at a really large company like Microsoft for a good part of it, I was actually working with very entrepreneurial people and teams, building largely new products for Microsoft and for the industry, and certainly doing things that were very much revolutionary for the industry. And I realized that I'd been working with entrepreneurs all along, even though they were at this big company. And so that's where the idea came from, and the recognition that the technology that we experience and live with every day is really the culmination of the work of thousands and thousands of people at many companies. And it certainly includes the work of some of these great datapreneurs that I highlight in the book. And their accomplishments have really led us to where we are today. And so I wanted to highlight that and describe why some of these things are so important. And give some people some background on the technology so they have some foundation, because obviously it's impacting all of us as we see AI being really the topic du jour of 2023 and clearly going to have a huge impact on all of us.
That's great, Bob. Having read the book, I can tell you that you reference a number of datapreneurs that you worked with in the past and ones that you're working with currently in a variety of different companies. But first and foremost, Bob, when I think about you, I think of you as a datapreneur. Given what you've accomplished with data at Microsoft and then more recently at Snowflake and the impact you're having today with a variety of startups, I see you first and foremost as a datapreneur. But you also worked with many other datapreneurs over the span of your career. How would you categorize the role the datapreneurs have played in your career?
Well, they're the source of all inspiration in some senses. I'm not the deep technologist that builds the product and the code. Mostly I was highlighting the people that did that were actually in there building core parts of the technology and creating some of the revolutionary ideas that have led us to where we are today. My role, as you know so well, since we worked together for many years, my role was really being what Microsoft would call a program manager. Modern term is more of a product manager. But in the Microsoft definition of it, it was really more about the product and building the product and defining the product for the customer. So I'm used to specifying things, talking to customers, understanding their requirements, and then passing those requirements on to the technologists and the architects inside the engineering teams that build things. And that's sort of always been a core part of my role. As a manager and as an executive, a lot of that comes down to leadership principles, running organizations, instilling values into teams, things like that. I see my role as being very different than a lot of these brilliant people that are actually coming up with these incredible ideas. I couldn't do that, but I have the ability, hopefully, to help provide them with some guidance to help as people are building the products.
Absolutely, Bob. Absolutely. I want to go back to a little bit the Microsoft timeframe, Bob, now. If I remember right, you came pretty early into Microsoft at that time. Microsoft was working on Windows and OS2 and LAN Manager and starting to work on Windows NT and maybe even the early days of...
Windows NT slightly after that. It was really, it really got started in the latter part, right?
Yeah.
But yes,
yeah,
that's the very beginning. So
from your perspective, if you look back in time, when did you feel like, hey, data is going to be a key part of the future of the world? When was that moment in time where you felt, there is something here that is going to fundamentally change how the world is going to be operating?
Well, no matter how much I tried to get away from it, I kept coming back to data, or data kept coming back to me in a way. My first job, the technical job, while I was still in college, was working for a company in Ann Arbor called Condor Computer, which had a relational and honest to God relational database. It had a join command. It was not SQL. It was the very earliest days. SQL was just emerging at that point. This was in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And it ran on a tiny microcomputer with these massive 8-inch floppies that stored almost nothing and literally 16K of memory, That was my first experience, and that was building applications for companies. In college, I was focused on communications. And my first job out of college was at Rome Corporation, which built a telecommunication system for business, an internal switch called a PBX. Our term was a CBX. That was Rome's product. And I worked on the team that configured those products. And so again, I had a data-focused job, and I was building data-oriented solutions when I was at Rome. And it was really that experience at Rome that led to my moving to Microsoft, largely driven by my wife's desire, our collective desire to move up to the Seattle area. We were in the Bay Area at the time, and her really finding Microsoft as being an incredible company that was emerging back then. I wound up joining Microsoft as the first technical person on SQL Server. And in a way that really, cemented the focus on data throughout the rest of my career, because SQL Server, the PC version of SQL Server that Microsoft offered, really did revolutionize business for smaller companies. And a large part of what we did in the 1990s was bring out both the server products as well as the database products and tools products. Visual Basic was a big part of that. So you had Windows Server and then and SQL Server, and Visual Basic is the front end for a lot of those early applications. And that's what automated the dentist's office of the world, is that software. And some of it's still running probably, which is probably not a good thing, but that really changed the way people worked with information.
That is cool. That's cool. I'm going back and forth in time here, but I want to sort of revisit what happened in the 2017 time frame. That is when we connected up on hey, Snowflake is coming along, is starting to make some revenue, has got some customers, and starting to realize the power of what Snowflake could be, kind of thing. First of all, thank you for giving us the opportunity to invest in Snowflake at the time and be on that journey with you. But one thing that I remember from one of our earlier conversations, Bob, is I was thinking about hey, how much should we invest? Is this because remember we are an early stage investment firm, but I remember you telling me hey, Soma, you're going to make money in this deal. I can't tell you how much, but you're going to make some money. And I was thinking hey, how much money am I going to make? Because the valuation was a little higher than what we were normally seeing at the time.
Seemed rich at the time.
Yeah, it seemed rich at the time. In hindsight, I would say hey, it just foreshadowed what the world was going to move towards, kind of thing. But I did not imagine, and I'll be the first to tell you, I did not imagine what kind of a trajectory Snowflake could have at that time. In fact, so much so that when Snowflake became a public company or went through the IPO process, ended up being the biggest software IPO in history. How did you sort of see the trajectory, and how did you feel about Snowflake becoming the largest IPO, kind of thing? But more importantly, what is that signal in terms of the importance of the data cloud platform to the future of the computing world?
It was really great working with you in the early days. And that was really when we were looking at opening an office in Bellevue and bringing in talent in the Seattle area. And that was driven by our desire to move to Azure as a platform, as a second platform. We were on AWS already. We wanted to add Azure as another choice for customers. And the realization that there was nobody in the Snowflake team that could work with Azure down in San Mateo, California. We needed some people up north to help that. And, obviously this has worked out very well. I knew the company was going to do very well. It certainly exceeded my expectations in that regard. And, the IPO was extremely successful. I would say it was really successful from the perspective, but for public investors, I have a little bit of concern because the stock went way high, and it's now still trading below that amount, which is definitely hard for public investors. But it's been incredibly successful, and I knew it would do well. How well, I didn't know. The reality of it is the reason it's been successful is because it solved a problem that was not solved before, and that was how do you scale your databases for analytics to be able to consume and work with all the data you wanted to at the same time and make that information available to all your end users. Up to that point, the technology before Snowflake really didn't enable that. And Snowflake was a breakthrough product in the sense that it really was the first to enable a general purpose SQL database that allowed for unlimited scale. And, I think that has been amazingly valuable because people are working with data and information. It's only getting more valuable over time as we begin to find more and more uses for data. And certainly the emergence of these large language models and artificial intelligence that is obviously of great interest right now, that raises the importance of data even further. And so I think all of these things are important. Now, Snowflake, as I've said it a number of times, I see Snowflake as being in three somewhat different businesses. They're in the sort of more traditional data analytics, data warehouse business. They're in the data sharing business and have now established a very strong position in helping companies access data that is outside of their organization and make sure the data can be appropriately shared within the organization. And then more recently, they've been really focusing on an application platform, a coherent application platform, the so-called data cloud that provides a set of coherent services for people that are building these next generation intelligent applications, AI applications, data applications, call them what you want, and then enabling those to run anywhere that Snowflake runs. They've emerged as an important player in the application market, and that's a fairly new space for them. But it's going to become increasingly important as we begin to build application services, these intelligent application services that take action on our behalf. And the fundamental distinction is that a typical business application acts on the behalf of a direct request from an end user, from a person. These class of applications take actions based on information that's coming into them, and they can do things on their own. So it's a whole different way of working and creating different business process. But I think it's going to become a very big part of what people are doing in the next 5 years.
And the thing that was interesting to me, Bob, as I thought about Snowflake and the Snowflake's journey, kind of thing, you literally have five what I call data cloud platform vendors of some scale and consequence today in the world, right? You got the three hyperscalers, the cloud infrastructure guys in Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, and then you got Snowflake and Databricks. And I don't know that I would have predicted say 8 years ago that there's going to be five cloud data platform at scale vendors kind of thing, right? So it's just fantastic to see how the hyperscalers obviously that's not a surprise that they are meaningful players here. But the fact that Snowflake and Databricks have been able to come to where they are today, it's just fantastic to see the innovation and how broad the space is and the opportunities ahead in terms of how this can fundamentally change what I call the world of computing and by extension, all applications and everything else that people do on that. I want to come to your book now for a second. There was a great thing that you talked about in your book called the arc of data innovation. To me, I was excited when I read through that because it helped me think about hey, how do we visualize our technology progress while making predictions, knowledge predictions of what could happen in the future kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about how you came up with that and how that concept came to life in the book?
It was always, in a sense, the central concept of the book, and it had been present from the earliest versions of it in some form. The idea is that there has been an acceleration of progress over time as technology has continued to improve. And that's why I drew it as an arc, because the line represents the speed of progress. And that's increased as the decades have gone by. And the idea of it was to identify both the key data types, the key types of data that were introduced. People don't always think about it. There's structured data, there's text data, there's semi-structured data, and then there's what people often call unstructured, which I would call complex data, and that's like video and audio. It really has structure associated with it. It's just that the structure is so complicated that we tend to think of it as unstructured. And those sources are now real sources of data that they never were before in the past. That idea of that progressive evolution was always present. The interesting thing is that the finish of it changed while I was writing the book, because when I started writing the book, the apex of it was the data economy and the idea that data is a central part of what we do in our business. And what I recognized was that as I was writing the book and I saw the explosion of what's happening in the AI space, I realized that the horizons that I had thought in my head for when some of this intelligent technology was going to become available and useful and really achieve some major milestones like artificial general intelligence and potentially superintelligence, those were going to happen in a much shorter horizon than I expected. If you asked me in 2021, when would we have AGI, I would have said 2100. And now I will say 2030, thereabouts. That's a pretty dramatic change. And frankly, it was a breathtaking realization for me, because I had always believed that we would develop this intelligent software, that would come, but I just didn't think it was going to happen in my lifetime. And now I realize it is. And the implications to all of us are just really profound. And so the arc of data innovation, really now goes to superintelligence and potentially a technological singularity, which is just really a continued acceleration of progress, largely faster than human speed. I think it's going to happen. It's certainly something that's, in general, I think it'll be very positive, but I know it's also a bit scary at the same time. And I think, it is not 50 years away. I think it's probably a lot less than that.
Yeah, I think this notion of predicting, when you're going to see major inflection points in technology, I think it's anybody's guess kind of thing. But it's one of those things where, sometimes we overestimate and sometimes we underestimate. I actually remember, when I was still at Microsoft back in the 2012, 2013 timeframe, if you talk to any of the traditional automobile companies, hey, when are you going to have a truly self-driving car? They were all talking about 2030, 2035, 2040 kind of thing. And then for a while there, with the self-driving progress that companies like Tesla made, everybody thought hey, in the next 3 years, it's going to happen. The reality is it's somewhere in between kind of thing, right? But the rate of innovation is the one that I think I'm most excited about, because that sort of signals what is possible, and whether it is actually 2021 or 2025 or 2030, we cannot debate that.
Well, I mean, I having played with Teslas and things, I've always from what I could see, the technology was still a few years away. I've had thought, and this is just getting reinforced in the past set of months, that the 2030s would be the era of robotics, and that we're going to see another explosion of innovation in autonomous robotic devices that are part of our lives in a variety of ways, ultimately resulting in humanoid robots that have intelligence and can do things on our behalf. The interesting thing about a car was, the autonomous car, which was, I think about an Uber ride, and every Uber ride that I've ever been in ends with a brief conversation with the driver about where to drop you off. I was like, well, how are you going to do that with a machine? And now I realize you can just tell it. You'll be able to tell the robotic car where to drop you off. So, some of the problems that seemed very intractable, now that English is a language that computers can understand, a whole bunch of problems that were there before disappear and become at least potentials to solve.
That is very true. That's the power of NLP or natural language processing, I guess. You're right. Hey, you can talk to a machine, and pretty soon, I think, you're gonna, you can already, touch a device, with touch screens. You can now speak to a device. The interaction, the more you can interact with the device or with a machine or a system, similar to how you interact with each other, the more natural it's going to be, and the more people can seamlessly, think about computing in an ambient environment, as opposed to hey, I need to walk up to a machine or I need to walk up to a device, as opposed to I'm just doing I'm going through my life, I'm doing my job, I'm sort of having fun, and I can leverage technology in my natural workflow, so to speak. And I think that's a exciting world that I'm looking forward to. And like you said, for a while there, it wasn't clear whether it's going to happen in our lifetime or not. But I think the rate of innovation, there is a fond hope that it could happen well within our lifetime. So we'll see how it goes.
Even for old people like us, but for the youngsters in there, I think they're going to see a whole lot of, for people who are in the earlier stages of their career, they're going to see a massive amount of change. Think about the fact that these devices have intelligence in them. We've always been able to put rules in, you've always been able to program rules in a computer. But now you can actually take and have intelligence associated with decision-making. It's really extraordinary. It's an extraordinary innovation.
That's true. Bob, you can't talk to a company today without them telling you why they are an AI company. Every company says that.
Certainly you can't. You can't. That's for sure.
But here is the thing that, and we sort of have this taxonomy, at least a mental model that says, hey, there are going to be AI native companies, and then there are going to be AI enhanced companies. Which means most companies that exist today, they have to sort of think about how to incorporate AI in fundamentally core parts of what they are doing as a business or as a company kind of thing. The challenge though is all of these companies have an existing what I call data architecture. How they think about data, how they deal with data, how do they process data, how do they take advantage of data kind of thing. As AI becomes more and more central and core to every business and every company, how should an existing company, where should they even start about hey, I want to sort of be an AI first company, but I do have a way of doing things today with data. What should I do? Any sort of thoughts on what you would tell companies?
One of the really interesting things about this technology is that it really can be additive to existing applications and add value. And I think Microsoft demonstrated that with this copilot approach, which I think will be the predominant, at least initial way in which AI will be incorporated into existing applications, which is these agents that sort of support you in your efforts to do things. And I think most companies who have an existing product can take and modify that product to put in one of these copilots that can build off of the knowledge basis that it has. And fundamentally, essentially, just be a much more effective help system to help you work and navigate through the product you have. If you don't have an existing product, but you have a business that you're running, one of the interesting things that now there are opportunities to build applications that couldn't be built before. And here I always just say, what is the domain expertise that you bring? Because it's now possible to effectively take that domain expertise and leverage the intelligence in these large language models to bottle effectively the expertise you have and put it inside the application so that the knowledge and behavior and processes that you created can now be run and executed by the machine versus by people that previously performed these actions. And so there's opportunities across the board to do that. If you're in an existing business whether you have an existing application where you can obviously take the knowledge base and everything you did and directly incorporate it, or whether you're building something new. And then I'd say, just to continue along the lines of the different types of apps you say, there's just new kinds of applications that you couldn't build before that now for the first time can be done.
That is true. I fundamentally believe that AI is going to permeate every industry, every company, every walk of human life kind of thing. Okay. But having said that, if you think about the different verticals or the different industries, do you think some are more naturally attuned to having the most innovation and positive impact by AI, or do you think it's just going to be across the board?
I think it's pretty horizontal. I mean, like anything, there'll be uneven distribution of it. And certainly different industries will have different speeds of adoption, somewhat based on the regulatory challenges they face. And, frankly, in some industries, take the medical industry, for example, we have to make sure that the technology is matured to the point where it's working correctly. I mean, if AI hallucinates and writes a poem incorrectly or something, or puts something in a poem, it's one thing. But if it misreads a doctor's notes and that results in a patient getting the wrong drug, that would be very bad. So you want to make sure you have very high degrees of accuracy in certain scenarios. And so that will take a little bit more time, but every domain will be impacted. And it will certainly impact a lot of people in their careers and jobs, because the more mundane, sort of repetitive tasks, the tasks that tend to be repeated, those are the ones that have historically been the provenance of people. Those are the sorts of tasks that will wind up being automated first.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book is, in addition to talking about data technology, the modern data stack, what's happening in the world of data kind of thing, you go through what I call case studies or specific examples of companies and the kinds of technologies that they're building. You talk about many, many different companies, developing solutions for what I broadly refer to as the modern data stack. But having said that, do you think there are still white spaces or big problems that need to be solved? And particularly, if you are talking to the next generation of startup founders, right? What would you tell them about, hey, what opportunities exist in the modern data stack? Or do you think that's all being solved and people should just move on?
Well, it's not all being solved. Let me just start by saying that. The modern data stack has made great progress. As you mentioned earlier, there are really 5 different vendors providing solutions. It's good to see those solutions maturing over time. They all come from different places. They all started from a different place, but they're all kind of building the same product now. They're all heading towards similar products that they're creating, although there's strengths and weaknesses of the vendors, like I say, largely associated with their history. There are definitely open spots in the modern data stack that still need to be filled, largely around compliance and management. Those are areas where I think there's a lot of challenges still. Certainly access control and managing coherent data access control continues to be a significant problem that I don't feel is well solved. I think one of the biggest areas of future potential is building and creating what people talk about as semantic models for different things. In particular, I think it's interesting to think about the semantic model for a business. If you look at any company's business product, any organization's business, and their process associated with executing their business, it's the knowledge of how that works is scattered in different spots. It exists somewhat in the applications they run. It exists somewhat in the analysis things that people do using tools like Tableau and Power BI. It exists in the heads of a bunch of people. It exists in documentation, and probably maybe more than anything in Slack messages. And, it's all over the place, and it's not very well defined. In order for these language models, these agents, to behave in a way that is consistent with what we want, they need to understand the semantic model of the business. And so I think we have to be much more explicit about that. Because if we want these machines to do things for us, we're going to have to explain what we want them to do. And today, where would they look? I mean, it's all over the place. So I think centralizing that is going to be a fairly major opportunity. I've made the statement, I think this is an accurate statement, which is one profession which has emerged as a really interesting profession in the last few years, which is data engineering. I think that profession is going to change over the next few years to become business engineering. And we'll begin thinking not just of the way the data is modeled, but of the overall business model, and ultimately we'll derive the data models from it. That's where this concept of knowledge graphs come in. And I believe these things can be very coherent with the large language models.
Bob, one of the things that you've done, like in the last couple of years at least now, is be an active investor, as I mentioned before, in the next generation of data companies in one way, shape, or form kind of thing. If you put on your investor hat for a minute, how do you evaluate which company you want to invest in and be a part of kind of thing? Like, what traits do you look for as you make that decision?
The traditional thing is the best return on your investment, right? That's probably the traditional focus of, most venture capitalists. That's really not high on my list. I mean, I want something to be successful, obviously, but actually focusing on the actual return is not what I'm caring about as much. I care more about the technology and the impact that the technology is going to have on the industry and the world as a whole. So I try and focus my time on companies that I think are doing things that have the potential to have a material change in the way the industry works. One of the reasons working with infrastructure technologies, it provides the opportunity to do that because they tend to be very horizontal versus just applications which are focused on a given vertical or a given industry. So most of my focus is on horizontals, largely because I've always had kind of an infrastructure focus. So in a way, my criteria is about the importance of the technology, the relationship with the entrepreneur and the CEO, and the potential impact for this in the world. And that would be where I really put my key focus. And to me, the return is a more secondary thing. And in fact, one of the questions people always ask is, what's your check size? And I'm like, well, really, I follow what you need and what the other investors do. To me, the important thing is supporting the organization.
I actually agree with what you said, Bob, about what you look for kind of thing, because as much as venture capital industry is about making sure that we have the right returns on our investment, not just for us, but also for our LPs kind of thing. To me, focusing on the team and the impact automatically will lead you to sort of greater pots of gold along the way kind of thing, right? So
I think they're very related. I mean, they're very related together, but it's just a question of, is it a spreadsheet-driven decision or is it more of an impact-driven decision? It's the latter.
Got it. Bob, before we wrap up, I want to ask you one final question. If you were to start a company today, what kind of an AI company would you start? I'm assuming it'll be something to do with data and AI, so I'm presuming that. But what would you want to do in today's landscape?
Well, and I will do this serendipitously through the entrepreneurs that I work with, and I am sort of doing that in a way. But it's really what I described about that business semantic model. That to me is building high-level semantic models of everything is of interest. I think about this one sometimes, but I haven't braved myself to go into it yet, which is the semantic models associated with legal contracts and laws. Because I think there's a discipline called computational law where you can apply computational approaches to legal problems. And really a contract is a program. It's a program that is interpreted by lawyers and executed by people. And I don't think that's the way things are going to work for very long, because in a fairly short time period, machines will also interpret these contracts, and much of the execution of the task will be done by the machines. So I think we're seeing a transition of high-level semantic concepts into executable form that can be operationalized within the business. And so it would be along those lines that I would put my focus right now. And whether the domain is management of the IT infrastructure, which is an interesting domain, or whether it's a different domain like law, all of those things are potential applications.
Bob, as always, it was a fun conversation. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today, and really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you.
Thanks, Soma. It's always great talking to you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Founded and Funded. If you're interested in reading Datapreneurs, visit www.thedatapreneurs.com. That's www.thedatapreneurs.com. If you're interested in attending our IA Summit, visit ia40.com/summit. Thank you again for listening, and tune in a couple of weeks for our next episode, which features Mark Nelson, former CEO of Tableau, and James Phillips, former head of Power BI. You won't want to miss these two discussing product-led growth and scaling in the face of big competition.